All right. Well, thank you. As you said, I'm the Agricultural Conservation Programs Field Manager at the National Great Rivers Research and Education Center. That officially gives me the longest title in the history of conservation. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about. Can you hear me back there? Is that working? Now? Can you hear me now? All right, great. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about conservation easements. I'm a forester at heart. Talk a little bit about this is my family's 80-acre family forest down in southern Missouri. I have a bachelor's degree in forestry, and I've practiced forestry. But most of my career has actually been doing conservation easements, which are pretty new and a pretty cool conservation tool that has a lot of potential, but there's a lot of aspects to it that. Am I coming through? All right. A lot of aspects to think through on these conservation easement projects. So I'm just going to sort of run through an intro to conservation easements. I'm going to do my best to break the rules today. We're going to stop for questions twice. After I get your head spinning, we're going to stop for questions, and then we'll keep going and have a question and answer session at the end. So just to get started, again, sort of as I've already discussed, my goal today is just to add this tool of the conservation easement to your forest stewardship toolbox. So a lot of us are probably out in the woods implementing our management plans, getting our management plans, working with our forester, doing timber stand improvements. We're really actively involved in our woods and probably thinking about the future of our woods. And that's one of the unique things about a conservation easement. It's one of the tools where we can really look at what happens to these woods beyond my time. When I get done managing these woodlands, what happens to them? And unfortunately, across the U.S. and in each of our 3 states, is we're seeing a lot of our family forest lands broken down into smaller and smaller parcels. They're harder and harder to manage, harder and harder to get timber products and all the other benefits that we get from these forest lands, just like we were talking about with the last presentation on forest interior birds. As these forest lands break down, get smaller and smaller, we are losing the benefits they provide to us. So as an example, again, I mentioned my family's 80-acre tree farm. My grandfather purchased that right back from World War II, paid for college for my mother and her brother. My parents didn't give 2 thoughts about forestry till I got involved with the farm, and now for the last 6-7 years we've gone down and done timber stand improvement every year. And it's really been my goal to make that part of the family rather than just a few rocky, glady acres down in the Ozarks. So the outline of our talk today, and it looks like we're missing a little bit of this slide, so bear with me. First, we're just going to talk about what in the heck is a conservation easement. How many people in here have heard, just show of hands, conservation easement mentioned? Okay, so almost everybody in here has at least heard of a conservation easement. How many people would characterize themselves as very, very familiar with conservation easements? All right, we got a total of 3 here. So we're going to talk a little bit about what exactly it is. Got a couple scenarios to make it real, and then talk about how does it actually work. And then there's supposed to be 3 more bullets that here that talk about, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of conservation easements, the things that really make sense with conservation easements and the things to watch out for. Along those same lines, we'll have a little bit of talk about the pitfalls of conservation easements, and then finally we'll talk about who does them, what opportunities there might be, how you might look for funding or other financial benefits from a conservation easement. All right, so just to get down to the most basic definition, a conservation easement is a legal agreement between a landowner and a land trust or government agency that permanently limits the use of land in order to protect its conservation values. It allows the landowner to continue to to own and use their land, and they can also sell it or pass it on to heirs. And just the pictures here, the first conservation I ever worked on, which I passed around a little paper about that, the Kulak family out in northeastern Pennsylvania. It's a really cool story that they just finished up here in the last month or 2. So when thinking about property ownership, every landowner, all property owners enjoy a bundle of sticks that we can think of as property ownership. When we buy a piece of property, it usually comes with a number of rights. You know, we have water rights, we have hunting rights, we have the right to subdivide, we have the right to control access, the right to develop, and I'm not going to go through the whole list, but when we buy a piece of property, we essentially inherit a bundle of sticks, a bundle of rights that come with that property. And for forever, pretty much, we've been messing around with that bundle of sticks. We may temporarily lease it off for hunting, so we're temporarily handing to somebody else the right to enjoy that property, to possess and occupy it for a certain amount of time, to access it, and to hunt it. Or we might, I wouldn't do this myself, but we might sell our mineral rights. So we're actually giving somebody else the right to extract those minerals out from underneath us, the right to drill underneath us, maybe even drill on the surface a little bit. And there's countless examples of how we've kind of been messing with that bundle of sticks. One scenario that'll kind of put that into a conservation easement context is Jake Tree Farmer's third generation tree farm is under pressure. It's not, but let's pretend it is. Developers are knocking on the door with subdivision blueprints in hand. After a lifetime of hard work tending to the crop trees, the only memory of those crop trees will be the cul-de-sac that they named White Oak Court. Jake Tree Farmer couldn't possibly stand to see the farm broken up to build just another cookie cutter subdivision, but don't seem to be many other options. So the solution to that might be a working forest conservation easement. A nonprofit entity known as a land trust might purchase a conservation easement from Jake Tree Farmer to prevent it from being developed. They would find a funding source or some other mechanism to purchase that conservation easement, and in return the land trust would agree to enforce forever an agreement preventing subdivision development, maybe drilling and mining on that tree farm. So past my lifetime or somebody else's, this would always be a tree farm or able to be a tree farm. So we might give to that conservation organization we might give up the right to subdivide that property, the right to develop that property, or the right to drill and mine that surface. In return, the tree farm might remain a viable operation and certainly would retain much of its character as a tree farm despite the pressure to do other things with that farm. And just looking at it in the bundle of sticks sort of analogy is as a landowner, Jake Tree Farmer would retain most of the rights on that property, the right to access it, the right to enjoy it, the right to use it as a tree farm, pretty much everything, except he might give up these rights he didn't want to use anyway, the right to develop, the right to subdivide those things that he doesn't want to see his tree farm broken up with. But conservation easements take many shapes and sizes. There are many types of them. There are many different scenarios that we go through. So one thing that I'm proud to work on, one thing that I'm very proud to work on right now is the Illinois Conservation Reserve Program, which is the Illinois Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which is sort of the basis of our second scenario here. With the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which I put out a brochure about that as well, one scenario might be that Farmer Hendee is tired of losing crops to floods in his bottomland along the river once every 3 years. If there were another profitable alternative for that piece of ground, his agriculture operation might be better off. So solution, a CREP conservation easement. The County Soil and Water Conservation District and the Illinois Department of Natural Resources might partner to purchase a conservation agreement from Farmer Hendee. He would agree to implement conservation practices and place permanent restrictions on the future use of this piece of bottomland. And that's a lot of what we do with the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. It's in contrast to the Conservation Reserve Program where landowners just agree to take it out of production for 15 years and plant grasses, trees, restore the wetlands, things like that. With CREP, we actually place a permanent easement to protect that restoration over the long haul. And again, here's what that might look like on as far as the bundle of sticks would go. In this case, the landowner retains most of the rights to use and enjoy that property, maintain that restoration, harvest timber, things like that, but they've given up the right to drill and mine the surface, the right to develop it, the right to recultivate that wetland restoration or whatever it might have been. All right, I think we have got the wrong PowerPoint, so it may get interesting here in a little bit. But hang with me and we'll figure something out here. So to get this done, we're going to do it with a piece of paper. We're going to that conservation organization is going to work with that private landowner, or that private landowner is going to seek out that conservation organization and say, these are my goals, this is what I want to get done. How can we use a conservation easement to protect this property over the long term, or preserve this property over the long term? Now we're going to do it with a piece of paper. The landowner or the conservation organization are going to agree to several pages of what and what cannot be done with that property over time for this landowner and for the many future landowners that inherit that property. And the way that we're going to do that is by recording a grant of conservation easement or conservation easement at the county courthouse, just like any other property deed or say a public access easement that you would give to your neighbor, with agreed upon terms of what will happen over the long term. So the conservation organization will return, say, once a year, once every 3 years, to make sure the terms of that are upheld for all future landowners. That conservation organization will also commit to legally enforce it, which could include legal remedies. So here's where I'm going to break the rules first and say, what could possibly go wrong? Anybody want to play what could go wrong here? I guess we'll make it a rhetorical question. When I first got into conservation easements, I looked at this and said, how can these possibly last over the long term? This conservation organization's got to return, got to make sure the landowner understands what these terms are, and then somebody's going to break the rules eventually. So how in the world would we defend a conservation easement from these agreed to terms 50 years ago or 100 years ago, something like that? But the conservation organizations have persevered and really found a way to do this. And we still got slides with information on them, so we're doing good so far. And my question is, are conservation easements effective? Thus far, it appears they are. 1,723 land trusts hold 8.8 million acres of conservation easements as of the land trust census of 2010. And these organizations are required to set aside restricted funds to monitor, to make those site visits, to work with those landowners, and to legally defend those easements when you do get that bad landowner who wants to break out of that easement. And most recently, they've actually developed a pool of insurance to be even more safe, that yes, they will be able to return and enforce these agreements into the long term and really put in place those protections that you as the original landowner wanted to see to your property. So it's a exploding, I guess, industry, or an exploding movement that really seems to be finding its legs under itself, and really a popular tool to protect land over the long term, and seems to really have thought through a lot of those what could go wrong scenarios that I mentioned earlier. In addition to all these nonprofit conservation organizations that have really spearheaded this, local, state, and federal government agencies also hold millions more acres of conservation easements, which we'll look at here in a second. And in our 3 states, they actually appear to be the majority holder of acres as far as conservation easements go. So the font here is a little bit small, but this is data incomplete data that I pulled off the National Conservation Easement database. And for Illinois, we're looking at about 200,000 acres of conservation easements all around us. Federal acres being 80,000, most of those being in the Wetlands Reserve Program. and I think there's also quite a few in the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. Non-governmental organizations, we'll look at the list later, but there's a number of conservation organizations, nonprofits doing this work, and they've got about 20,000 acres of conservation easements, about 300. And then the state, and this is mostly the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, holds about 700 easements for about 100,000 acres. And this is incomplete. This doesn't include about the 95,000 acres that we have in state conservation reserve enhancement program easements either. So very incomplete list. These things are common. They're across the landscape, and you might be surprised where you're actually seeing them. I'm going to run through this pretty quick. Wisconsin, much the same. Federal government holds about 100,000 acres of conservation easements. NGOs hold about 10,000 acres, and state agency, mostly I believe the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, holds about 240,000 acres of conservation easements. Iowa looks to be the smallest state of the three, mostly held by the federal government with 170,000 acres of conservation easements, mostly in the Wetlands Reserve Program and the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. And this may be a very incomplete list that some of you could help me correct or make more complete. So with that said, I'm going to pause a little bit for questions. Do we have questions? I see one back there.
Jake, you asked what could possibly go wrong earlier. And the first scenario that I come up with, if it's a not-for-profit organization, will they be here in 50 years? Will they be here in 100 years? What happens with a legal instrument like a conservation deed or whatever if there's no viable entity there?
Mm-hmm. And that's what most of these conservation organizations have plans for. If we fold, if we can't keep the doors open, what will happen to these conservation easements? So as advice to a landowner is you might want to ask that question is what's going to happen if your organization doesn't exist? With that said, most of these organizations have been required to set aside the funding to do this for the foreseeable future. So and there's some arguments whether are they setting aside enough funding, but they do have restricted funds set aside to do this for a long period of time. Get you back there first.
So I guess a question kind of on the nonprofit side. I've heard a story of an individual who wrote a conservation easement that their heirs weren't specifically excited about. And so when the heirs inherited that land, they worked to fight it legally. And so I'm wondering, do nonprofits inherently take on a risk when they obtain these conservation easements? Is that something that they would have to pay the fees for to work for legislatively?
And the question was if heirs aren't very enthusiastic about a conservation easement, what are the implications for that conservation organization? And we'll get a little bit later. We'll talk about the pros, cons, and pitfalls. And one thing we work with landowners specifically is make sure the heirs are involved in that decision. Make sure that is part of the conversation because they are the future. They are going to inherit the property, and one of the ways to prevent problems is working with the landowners to do that. And in some cases, that organization might not want to complete that conservation easement if it were such a tenuous situation. So I see a lot of hands up. I want to keep going. We'll leave some questions here for the end, or when I run out of slides, we might have a really long question session. So, all right. So the pros of conservation easements. Let's talk about the positives first. They appear to be a pretty effective tool to really convey an intergenerational conservation legacy. Whether that be working forest, is the tree farm, is preserving those factors that make a tree farm a viable operation, is that most important to you? Or is it open and wild space? Do you just want that property that you've always had for recreation to stay in that state, available for recreation, a nice big parcel where you can have the family out for hunting season, or have the family out for a spring hike or something like that? Or is it about agricultural preservation? With the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, we take poor farmland out of production. But on the same token, we want to see that prime agricultural land is preserved for farming. And more that's getting split up and broken off for other uses as well. Or another thing we've seen, which I'm not a particularly big fan of, is just forever wild easements. You can't do anything with it. You just let it go and take out all the disturbance and see what happens. And the pros of conservation easements is there are financial benefits to doing such a thing. With a lot of the programs available, a lot of those federal acres that we saw earlier, the Wetland Reserve Program, the Emergency Watershed Protection Program, things like that, there are specific priority areas where there's really nice funding available to purchase conservation easements from landowners, if they want to restore that wetland in the frequently flooded area or something like that. There's also a set of income tax benefits for people who don't have necessarily a funding source available to them, but really feel this is an important thing to do for the future, is to set aside that conservation land. And in the most common scenarios, the mix of conservation legacy and financial benefits are always what makes a conservation easement happen. It's just how those two factors are weighed oftentimes. Financial benefits of conservation easements, as we discussed, a lot of times with these targeted priority programs such as Wetland and Reserve Program, these are purchased conservation easements where the landowner is going to be paid maybe 100% of the appraised value of their conservation easement, or maybe a bargain sale, maybe 50% of the appraised value of their conservation easement, and that's enough to sort of get them over the hump, say, hey, we're going to do this project anyway. We'll talk a little bit about how that value is appraised here in a second. And then the other common thing you'll see out there are donated conservation easements. So again, this was more the landowners who really want to see that legacy preserved and protected over the long term. There are some incentives. They're not going to come out rich out of this deal, but in a lot of cases, if you donate a conservation easement, some of those rights to a conservation organization, you could receive the appraised conservation easement value deducted from your taxes, assuming that's up to 30% of income for 6 years. A year-to-year thing is the enhanced easement incentive, which year-to-year Congress sort of messes with this, and sometimes there's better incentives one year than others. Currently, it's just this up to 30% of income for 6 years. And then for landowners struggling with estate tax issues, selling off half the farm to pay the estate tax bill, conservation easements have some tax benefits as well. But I won't go into those for the purpose of this talk. And the fun part of this is you get to play games with the IRS. So I know we all love doing that. So what is actually the value of a conservation easement? How would I get paid 100% of my conservation easement value, or what would be 50% of my conservation easement value? And this is sort of done according to a set of appraisal rules. What is the value of my property before this conservation easement? What could I sell it on the open market before I put this conservation easement on it, versus what could I sell it on the open market after I put a conservation easement on it? That would be your appraised conservation easement value. So I think I see some red flags going up, but we'll just keep on going as far as land value with conservation easements is concerned. The cons of conservation easements is if you decide to set aside this conservation legacy, whether somebody's purchasing that conservation easement from you or whether you're donating that to a conservation organization, is your market value of your land is going to go down. You're not going to be able to sell your land for as much. And I've got two really contrasting examples here. The first scenario here is the Milford Experimental Forest in Milford, Pennsylvania. This is where Gifford Pinchot, the father of forestry, practiced forestry when he was probably about my age. So here I think the town of Milford's down this way, and if you drive down Highway 6 here, you will end up in downtown Manhattan, in about hour and 15, probably an hour and 2 hours with traffic. There, as you can see, this is under high development pressure. Most of this is being split up into woodland subdivisions where little acres here and there where it's pretty dang tough to practice forestry in this area anymore. It's high value. I did a little shopping, and each one of these little 1 acre vacant parcels sell for about $40,000 a piece. So the Pinchots decided that they really wanted to preserve their legacy, the legacy of American forestry, basically here with the Milford Experimental Forest. So they put it in a working forest conservation easement, which basically means it can't be developed, it can't be subdivided, they can't go in and put a frack well on top of it. They are saving that to practice forestry on top of that. And so they worked with my former employer, much before I worked there, the Delaware Highlands Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, to put a working forest conservation easement on that, where they secured several funding sources to get the project done, and the Pinchots were paid a fraction of the value for that conservation easement because it was such a valuable property, but they preserved that forestry legacy on that property. Their land value went down significantly. They can't sell $40,000 1 acre lots on their 1,200 acre parcel. They can practice forestry, and we can't make that much money in forestry, at least not yet. Versus this parcel in the Kaskaskia River Basin in southern Illinois, which is a typical Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program parcel. It's flooding all the time. It's a tough parcel to farm. It's right there along the Kaskaskia, and this is actually a fake parcel. I don't know if this is actually under conservation easement or not. But for this landowner, is their value for very marginal farmland maybe pretty similar to that conservation and recreational value that they're still preserving on that property. So while they're getting paid from the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program to take this out of production, their land value may actually not go down that much. So we want to think about land value as a con of conservation easements, but it's very different project to project, and something to really think through as an individual landowner for your individual situation. Another con of conservation easements is flexibility. Is if we're going to dedicate our property to conservation, for the remainder of our lifetime, for our kids' lifetimes, is we lose some of that flexibility to do different things, such as develop the property, such as subdivide the property, such as drill on that property, or whatever terms you may negotiate with the conservation organization or conservation agency. When working with landowners, it's important to think through a host of considerations and ensure that the conservation easement is right for the individual situation at the individual time, because you do commit that property to a specific form of conservation, which, as we discussed earlier, may be a number of different things, but you do commit to that the day you sign that conservation easement, and that's a huge consideration. The landowners that terrify me the most are the ones who really say that, let's do it, I don't want to think about it, versus the well-informed landowners. I love working with those people, asking tons of questions, going out to the property a lot, really understanding and appreciating what they're putting into conservation easements. And just some ideas about what things you might think about in planning for the future of a working forest parcel or working farm parcel, or things of that nature. So here, just another example of thinking about flexibility is here is the family tree farm down in southern Missouri. It's a 80-acre rectangle here. But when I put a conservation easement on it, do I want to put a conservation easement on the whole parcel? Or do I want to reserve, say, a little area here in purple to say develop for a maintenance shed area in the future? Or maybe I even want to reserve a home site up here where I could potentially put a home for my children or grandchildren in the future. These are all things done with conservation easements. But thinking through it even further, this would be a terrible place for a septic system for a future home. So maybe I'd want to move it down here into the better soils for a septic system. There's a huge number of considerations that go into these things, and we don't want to make it sound like it's just you sign at the dotted line tomorrow sort of a thing. Maybe I want to leave myself open to subdivide the property once one parcel for each of my 2 children. Or maybe I only want to put this half in conservation now and wait to do this half later because I want to develop it a little bit more heavily. Tons of options. Conservation organizations and the state agency, federal agency folks who work out there will hopefully help you work through a lot of these scenarios to understand what situation fits your property the best, if any. A couple pitfalls. Who's your partner in conservation? I was once talking to a group about conservation easements in forestry, and one of the first comments to come out of the audience before I could even talk about what a conservation easement was, well, you can't cut trees on a conservation easement. Yes, you can if you agree, if you sign up for those terms. If you work with a forestry-friendly organization or you work with a conservation agency that really appreciates forestry and puts that in their conservation easements. In that specific case I was talking about, the easement had left it up to one person's decision whether they could cut trees on that conservation easement forever. And unfortunately, somebody who wasn't very friendly to forestry was in that position at the time. A huge thing when talking about the pitfalls is what does it actually say? What are you agreeing to? With a conservation easement, you know, I'd be pretty comfortable agreeing to a conservation easement that you know, might not allow me to subdivide, develop a property that I didn't want to subdivide and develop anyway. But if it said you will not harvest timber on that conservation easement, I'm walking out the door right now. I'm a forester at heart, and it is extremely important to me what that conservation easement you're agreeing to says about what you can do with that property and what will be done with that property in the future. And then, as we mentioned, things change. Is it reasonable to do this over the long term? What considerations can we incorporate into that to make sure this is effective over the long term? How much time do I have left?
You have about 20 minutes.
All right. Does that include questions?
No.
All right. Well, I'm not going to run through each of these steps. I want to open it up to questions here pretty quickly. But just some steps to a conservation easement that you might think about in running through the process. If you are talking to a conservation organization or a government agency about doing some sort of a conservation easement. What are your long-term goals for the property? And the landowners that I tend to be most successful with or that I really enjoy working with are those landowners who say, you know what, this is a conservation property. I don't plan to develop it. I am comfortable setting this aside. Why not give up a conservation easement of development rights that I'm not going to use and that I don't want to see used in the future? And it's important for me to work with landowners that believe in preserving the character of that property. Is if somebody's in it just for the money, then that kind of scares me a little bit. But for the most part, the people I get to talk to are interested in preserving the character of that property, whatever it may be. And then keeping it in the family. There's a number of components that help to keep it in the family. As I mentioned, it has some estate tax benefits that prevent you from having to sell off half the property to pay the estate taxes. Hopefully most of us don't have to worry about something like that, but just taking that pressure from developers away and keeping it as one big parcel within the family is also a big component of doing a conservation easement. So the second step would be finding an organization that you want to work with. Land trusts are all over the place. I think we got lists here later. Those are your local nonprofits that work to do conservation easements. A number of federal agencies do. For the most part, that appears to be currently the Natural Resources Conservation Service appears to be the primary federal agency involved with conservation easements. And we just saw in the new Farm Bill, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, ACEP, just consolidated 3 easement programs into one, the Wetlands Reserve Program, the Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program, and the Grassland Reserve Program. So we only have to remember one acronym instead of three. But it's a little unclear actually what that means for us as far as how those programs will be done in the future. State agencies, Department of Natural Resources, or local units of government, soil and water conservation districts, or local farmland preservation board might be also people who would do conservation easements with you. Just a list of organizations that do conservation easements in Illinois. I'm going to fly through these pretty quick. In Iowa and in Wisconsin. Can you accomplish your goals with conservation easement? A lot of people mix up a forest management plan with a conservation easement. What can a conservation easement do? It can preserve the character of your tree farm. It can preserve it as working woodland for somebody else to implement a management plan down the road. Can you say this ought to be managed uneven age management forever? That's probably not a great idea to put in a conservation easement, and probably something that your agency or organization wouldn't work with you to do. And some other goals, really keeping it in a conservation land use. Goals best accomplished in other ways, specific ways to manage that property, uneven age management forever, or one example that I've actually seen, no dogs without a leash. How in the world are they going to enforce that? Funding sources, I think I'm running out of time. Forest Legacy Program, the new Farm Bill program, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. State funding sources, CREP, which is available to targeted areas in each of our states and done in very different manners. The Wisconsin Department of Ag, I can't remember what the other letters stand for, but purchase of agricultural conservation easements, and then Wisconsin DNR does conservation easements. I'm not really familiar with that program at all. I'm going to avoid the math, and I think this is where my slides run out. I'll post the full set of slides online. I promise there's a full set of slides out there, and we'll turn it over to questions. So that hand back there first.
What type of protection does the landowner have? Let's say the easement is engaged in with a local state or local government agency, and all of a sudden that agency's policies are changed for whatever reasons, legislative or otherwise. What protection does the landowner have?
What protection does a landowner have from, say, changes of an organization's policies? And that's an important point, is when we said the conservation easement is a piece of paper, the landowner needs to, agrees to the terms on that piece of paper, and oftentimes negotiate those terms on that piece of paper. So when that future government agency comes in and changes, the landowner is bound by the terms of that conservation easement, not what that agency decides to do for the day. One of the suggestions that we had talked about would be that landowner ought to think about how could a change of staff or a change of agency affect the terms of this easement. And I mentioned the example of the agency that decided forestry wasn't an approved use, and the easement actually said, well, it's up to this one person's discretion whether you can do forestry or not. So you probably wouldn't want to do something like that with your conservation easement.
They want to live by a golf course or a park or something, or your conservation easement. So basically what you're doing here is you are encouraging development around your place. And so my suggestion is to just say you're going to put up a nuclear, power plant. Don't do it, but say.
So does green space encourage development when you put a conservation easement on your property? And the answer is yes. Conservation easements are known to increase the property values next to the conservation easements because people, individuals, communities like green space, and that's why a lot of these, like local farmland preservation boards spend the kind of money they do on conservation easements, is because they benefit the local communities as far as having that green space and those scenic views available. Tom, I'll go with you in the back.
Are all conservation easements perpetual, indefinite, forever?
Are all conservation easements perpetual?
Right, I noticed you mentioned some government programs which are 15 years, and then you also say in there that conservation easements are perpetual. Is it both ways, or?
What I was talking about today as far as conservation easements, it was under the assumption that they're perpetual. As most of the conservation easements that you'll talk with conservation agencies or nonprofits about will be permanent conservation easements. There are some, such as our Illinois CREP program, where you can actually do an extended 15 or extended 35-year conservation easement. But for the most part, 98% of cases, you'll be dealing with a perpetual sort of situation.
I guess I have one recommendation to make, and that is choose your professionals wisely. You may have been dealing with your family lawyer for generations. If that lawyer is not done a conservation easement, you probably want to bring some extra help. If your accountant has never worked with tax rates, and they're kind of complex and confusing and changing all the time, you have to talk to one who knows about these things.
And that's, I'll just, rather than answering the question, I'll just agree with you 100%. Is one of those slides that should have been filled up is when working on a conservation easement, as somebody who's working with the landowner, I want to be working with a well-informed landowner who understands everything that they're doing with their property. And oftentimes that's working with or that's the landowner working with their family, an attorney, and a tax advisor. And somebody familiar with this sort of transaction is really important because it's a big decision. Don't want to understate that. Right here.
The gentleman back here mentioned eminent domain. Is that an issue if you have an easement and a municipality or whatever decides they want to put a thoroughfare through there? Is that viable?
Is eminent domain an issue? Eminent domain is the only thing that could annul a conservation easement, pretty much. That's the only thing you see. It cannot protect from eminent domain, and that reminds me of a couple other points I was going to make. As far as I've worked with landowners who want to do a conservation easement because they think it'll keep trespassers off their property. It might help if you got an extra set of eyes, you put up an extra sign, but no, that's not going to get it done. I'm trying to think of some other situations. Lower property taxes can or cannot be. A lot of times, another common drive landowners will have with conservation easements is, will it lower my property taxes? That's a really common theme, and the answer is it can or it can't. Investigate the individual situation.
Why in the world do I want to do this? Why do I want a conservation easement?
Why?
I control the land anyway. I mean, why do I want to put these strictures on it?
Why in the world would I do a conservation easement? And that's a question that a lot of landowners are going to ask, and some are going to say why. Some are going to answer that question with, why in the world would I do it? Conservation easement's probably not for you, versus somebody else who sees, I believe that this property should be in conservation for the next several generations.
Yeah, but I own it, so I can
Sure,
do that.
sure, and you're not going to be around forever, though. So basically, you're conveying that conservation legacy to a conservation organization to hold that for you over the long term, a lot of lands we work with is they say we're not going to subdivide it, we're not going to destroy it, we're not going to develop it. So why don't we go ahead and make sure it stays like that forever? And 50% of landowners are going to say, that's crazy, I'm in control of it, why would I do that? I don't necessarily trust this conservation organization. Do you know the conservation organization you're working with? Do you trust them? Do you trust them to carry out your goals over the long term? And some are going to say, absolutely, I trust them, let's do it. And some are going to say, I'm in control now, let's keep it like that. And that's the way the world works. I see a smile in the back, so I'm going to pick you first.
Like the wetland easements that the government buys through the farm program, is that land required to be in farm production first to be eligible?
I believe so. In most cases, at least some of the land has to be in ag production first. So it's restoring it and then keeping it out of production in those really marginal, heavily flooded areas. Next.
That goes along with my question, because there's some marginal bottom ground near my property, and what's to stop me from buying that property, turn around and get the NRCS maybe to pay me X amount of dollars for a permanent easement. Well, maybe I could get that property in that case. Do I have to own it for a certain amount of time, or can I say if I buy it for $5,000 and get them to pay me $3,000, I've got some property that's mine for $2,000 an acre net.
I'm so glad you asked that question. Can I buy land for $5,000 an acre, get a $3,000 per acre conservation easement, and then net $2,000, or I guess be in the whole $2,000 still?
But it's still my property.
And it's still your property. And the answer is yes, absolutely. But we talked about land value too. Is what's that land worth now? Was it productive farmland, or was it stuff that flooded all the time? What's its highest and best use? And so with CREP, one of our coolest stories is a guy that we've worked with. He did one project to test the waters, and he said, I kind of like this. I kind of like that big check I got at the end. And then he bought the next property next door, and he said, how much is that going to pay me? And he did the math and ran through it again. And last I heard, he's up to 6 properties. And he's a shrewd individual who certainly picks his properties wisely and does the math, but he's made it, restoring a watershed essentially made financial sense to him in his specific situation. Won't say that happens, that's necessarily a common case, but he certainly made it work.
What rights in an easement does an ordinary person have being on your property? Like you mentioned deer hunting or mushroom hunting. Is other people free to roam your property when you sign an easement?
With a conservation easement, are other people free to access your property? No, unless you agree to it. So some conservation easement programs, and I think it might be the case in Wisconsin here with the state, and it may have been in the past, I'm not 100% sure, it is, in order to fund it, they may have required at least limited public access onto your property. Myself, I'd be fine giving up a working forest conservation easement where I controlled the property and controlled trespassers, but I probably wouldn't give public access to my property. But again, that's an individual landowner decision, and it depends on the program, and it depends what that final conservation easement is written like. In the back.
Following on the gentleman in the front about why would you do that, you stressed before that it's important that your children are involved or your heirs, because if you do want something to do with that conservation program, wouldn't it be easier if they are not really up to date on all the government programs? Like our kids want to do what we want. They want to do what we want done when we pass on. It would make, would this program make it easier for them because the program is set up and they would have somebody to work with as far as maintaining?
As far as heirs, would a conservation easement sort of help them get through the tangle of conservation programs and have somebody for them to work with?
Yeah, especially if we have, if we're in agreement on what we want done with the land down through the kids.
I wouldn't say yes completely. You know, certainly it's great that they would have buy-in, and you would certainly have a conservation partner. But there are a lot of conservation partners out there to work with, whether you have a conservation easement or not. You know, when I worked for the nonprofit back in Pennsylvania, we had very close relationships with our landowners and very, you know, very personal, and we're really willing to help them out with anything. Is that universal? I don't know. So I guess you have an advocate for your land, but certainly I wouldn't say it's a point to really sell it on.
Do you have to shop around for an organization or a land trust? Some of them have minimum acreage requirements or minimum requirements for the type of tree or the slope of the land or things of that variety?
Do you have to shop around for a land trust? That was one of my last slides. Is one of my favorite organizations as an example is the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust. They're going to do things a lot differently than the land trust run by your local environmental group or something like that. And there are a range of nonprofit options out there for the different types of people, different types of conservation easements. With that said, some of these government programs where that funding is available, sometimes it's either that funding is there to do this with this organization or wait for another option down the road. So if you want to go into the new agricultural conservation easement program through the Farm Bill, you're going to be working with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, I believe in most cases. Or if you're going to be going through the Forest Legacy program with the U.S. Forest Service, then your State Department of Natural Resources is going to be your conservation easement organization. So yes, shop around is huge, but it may come down to program when the funding is the variable. Next question.
Is there a risk when you set one of these up of future generations, let's say great-great-grandchildren, having expenses to maintain? I mean, it's one thing for our generation to do this and make a little money, maybe not, but it would be a concern to me that way future generations, who I can't foresee, would have expenses that maybe they live in San Diego and they don't get out to even look at the land.
Would future generations have expenses or liabilities, risks in the future, several generations down the road, to maintain this? And the answer is yes. As with any property, there's still going to be property taxes on it. I can't think of any other big expenses down the road, but property taxes are really a huge thing. And hopefully your state's conservation easement program gets you in that lowest property tax bracket, or there are ways to do that. But certainly there are expenses down the road. How can you mitigate that? Planning for the future. Maybe you leave a parcel out of conservation easement in case they do need to develop it and sell it off as a lot, or they want to develop it as a home site. Definitely with practicing forestry, hopefully that's a way to pay the tax bill at least. With recreational properties especially, people are willing to pay pretty good prices for that land and pay a pretty healthy tax bill to maintain the ability to hunt whitetails on some of these properties. And that's with CREP they're recreational properties now that change hands pretty quickly.
Can you say more about the consequences if a landowner wishes to discontinue the easement?
As far as consequences, if a landowner wishes to discontinue the easement, these are permanent conservation easements, and you're committing to it for the long term. So it would involve legal action if you decided to discontinue the conservation easement. Fortunately, sort of with first-generation landowners, everybody's pretty well sold to the idea and understands why they did it and continue with it. But 3 generations down the road, as people may want to pull out a conservation easement, and they may want to discontinue it, and that's certainly a risk down the road that they want to pull it back out and put a shopping mall on it or something. That's part of with that conservation organization. Hopefully, they're going back and discussing what that responsibility is with that landowner in the future. Here in front.
I'm just wondering what would happen if you did leave it to some years and they couldn't pay the property taxes? Would it just go to the
Sure.
county or the state then?
Just like any other property, remember you're maintaining most of the rights on this property except for some of those rights to develop, subdivide, drill, things like that. If you couldn't pay the property taxes, maybe you'd sell it to a recreational landowner who wanted to hunt on it, or at the very least, just like any other property where you couldn't pay the property taxes, it would go wherever that goes. So.
It's my understanding that CRP and CREP are about the same, except that CREP follows along rivers that want to be protected. It's also my understanding that forestry land would not qualify for CREP. Is that correct?
CRP and CREP are the same, except CREP is in the bottoms, and then you can't enroll forest land in CREP. I'll answer the first question. Is CRP and CREP have the 15-year sort of 15-year payments arrangement, and then for those landowners who want to go into a permanent conservation easement with CREP, that's an additional option in addition to those 15 years of payments. So. When you hear the word CREP, it doesn't necessarily mean it's in a permanent conservation easement, but there is that option in most cases.
It's limited to land that borders these rivers that want to be protected. Is that correct?
In Illinois, it is limited to the 100-year floodplain in the 65 counties that cover the Illinois and Kaskaskia River basins, and the permanent conservation easements can include some forest land. I think that's different in both Wisconsin and Iowa.
Okay, I live in Kentucky, and they're trying to protect the Green River, and they're buying up, they're paying for pasture land. There's no cropland involved at all.
Mm-hmm.
And they're paying $250 to $300 an acre per year for pasture land. And are they paying that kind of money?
We're not seeing that kind of money in Illinois, except on the very.
It significantly raised the property values.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are old dirt farms, you know, that are $1,000, $1,500 an acre, $2,000 an acre, and all of a sudden you can buy them and get $300 an acre from the government.
The incentives with CREP are good because these are high priority watersheds, but we don't see those kind of rates except on the very best soils in Illinois.
You got time for one more question.
One more question.
And it's lunch.
All right. Oh, we'll finish off here. Is there a minimum size? Probably somewhere in the 20 acres range would be the minimum size for conservation easement. It all depends on conservation organization. I've seen them for less than an acre, but try talking your local conservation organization into that. They probably won't want to do it. So appreciate all the great questions, for filling out those blank PowerPoint slides. You asked all the questions I wanted to answer, so thank you.